This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
This morning on the show, we are talking about self-censorship when we are reading stories. We're thinking about the kind of stories that we tell our children and why we might choose not to read certain passages or include certain characters.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. This is your Saturday morning breakfast here on Teachers Talk Radio. It is Saturday, the 4th of October, 2025, and I am your host, Darren Lester. It is great to be having breakfast with you again this bright, sunny, albeit a little bit windy Saturday morning. How are you all doing? How has your week been? My week has been okay. It's been a little bit stressful, this one. I blame myself entirely because I believe it was last Saturday that I said that everything had been going really, really well and was really, really straightforward. So completely my fault for tempting fate, but that's all right. That's just how it goes. We made it. We are now here on Saturday. I always think if we make it to a Saturday morning breakfast, then we have done okay. No matter what else has happened in the week, as long as we have made it to breakfast on Saturday so that we can sit and chat about whatever issue it is that I've chosen for the week, then yeah, we have succeeded. And that means that once again, we have succeeded this week. I hope that those of you who are in the UK are staying safe during Storm Amy. I've only just found out what I've only just found out what she is called, and to be fair, I've only just realised that there's a storm going on. Clearly, I've been in my little teaching bubble for the last few days. Apparently, she's been raging since the 1st. We kind of started getting the high winds and the rain yesterday here in the southwest of England. Otherwise, it's been really, really calm. So I'm not going to say it because I'm not going to tempt fate like I did last week. But hopefully, everybody is okay. Everybody is currently safe. I was looking at the storm names for this academic year. I kind of love the fact that storm naming follows the academic year instead of the calendar year or any of the other myriad of years that we like to talk about. And I thought, what a great job that must be, coming up with names for storms. I know that it's not actually a job because, in fact, if you go onto the Met Office website, it explains how storms are named. I think it's really interesting. It talks about how they are named jointly between Met Erin, the Met Office in the UK, and the KNMI, that's the Dutch weather service. And there's actually an online form that you can fill in to suggest a name. Doesn't mean that they'll take it. And in fact, they kind of store names on the server and they pick them every single year. So just because you've suggested a name for next year, for 2026, 2027, if it's not used, it could still be used in 2030, in 2035, in 2090. But yeah, I thought what a great job that would be to name the storms, to kind of figure out how they are supposed to behave, what we are expecting them to be like, and then picking a name that is suitable, that fits. But then that's part of the human condition, isn't it? We do tend to anthropomorphize things. We tend to, in fact, I've literally just before we came on air read something that talks about how humans will tend to pack bond with anything. And it told this story of a young girl who was out shopping, and she rushed over to a box, picked it up, took it over to the counter, and explained to the server that she will buy anything in a box that is crumpled, in a box that is broken, because she's worried that nobody else is going to love whatever is inside. And I thought that was lovely. I've done the same thing. I have a nutcracker that I bought purely because he was the last one on the shelf, and I didn't want him to be lonely. Now, it's highly possible that that was a very clever marketing ploy from the shop, and that as soon as I walked out the door with him, they took another one out of the back and put him up on the shelf as the only nutcracker in the store. Um, but yeah, we do have this tendency, don't we, to anthropomorphize, to pack bonds, to to feel sorry for things, and that's how I feel about the storms. I think I would love to sit down and think about, like, Storm Bram is going to be the next one. I wonder what's going to make him a Bram. I wonder what about him is Bramley, Bramus. I don't know, whatever the adjectival form of Bram is. But that's just me being a bit soppy, I think. This morning we are talking about censorship, specifically censorship in stories. So we're having a think about the extent to which we do censor ourselves, why we might censor ourselves, and the cons of censorship. Because when we talk about censorship, we understand that there are cons, but the pros of it as well. Because if there weren't pros to censorship, then we wouldn't do it. So if you have anything to say on the topic of the day, you've got a couple of ways to get in touch. You can text straight into the Podbean app. I will read your message out live on air, and we can engage that way. I am now, albeit reluctantly, back on Blue Sky. I was influenced. I'm not even going to pretend that I wasn't. I was influenced. We had a show a couple of days ago here on Teachers Talk Radio, which was all about why academics need social media profiles, and kind of like how you build them, what you do with them, because I'm rubbish at social media. This is not the best way for me to attempt to build my Blue Sky profile and get you all to go over and follow me. But I am rubbish at social media. So sitting and listening to Timia talking about why social media profiles are necessary in academia, why we should be having them, and what they should comprise of, was really interesting. And while I am still very reluctant to kind of put text out on the web for free, because I am aware of the AI scraping. I've been, one day I promise I will stop talking about this, but today is not that day. I have been a victim of AI scraping, which is not very nice. That's the unethical use of my words, of my text, the non-consensual use of my words and my text for training large language models. And so I am very reluctant to put anything out, to be honest, that I'm not being compensated for, because I don't know how unethical people are going to use that information. But as was pointed out on Timia's show the other day, other people are using social media to build their profiles, and unless you are talking about the work that you're doing, nobody's going to know that you're doing it. So it's all very well and good, for example, me having a show here on a Saturday morning, but if I don't tell people that I've got one, then nobody's going to know that I have one, which I thought was fair. And Tom, when I was chatting to him about teacher social media a few weeks ago, was talking about the fact that, these large language models, they are here to stay. They don't care whether I'm boycotting them or not. They don't care if I'm not putting my stuff out online in protest or not. They are going to keep going. And so, kind of by not using them, and sort of by pulling the threads together, by not making people aware of my work, all I'm actually doing is screwing myself over. I'm not entirely sure still how I feel about it. I'm still playing with different ways to make sure that I can send these messages out, that I can engage with social media in a way that isn't going to have my stuff scraped, that isn't going to be taken without my permission, without my consent, without my knowledge. And we'll just see, I think, what it looks like. If nothing else, it's going to be an interesting experiment for me over the next year to kind of see what I think social media is going to look like for me. But yeah, if you want to engage with the show, Blue Sky is now another way that you can do that. It's my same old username. So I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER, all one word. I bet you have not missed me saying that. And I would be very happy to have you following me over there and to chat about any of the issues that come up on this show or any of the shows that we do in the future.
At AQA, we work with the UK's largest teacher network to shape the future of assessment. With teachers for students, we ask questions today that matter tomorrow.
The 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports that the union NAHT has advised school leaders to demand a full risk assessment from their employers over what it describes as the very real dangers to staff well-being brought about by the new Ofsted inspection framework. The NAHT says leaders should write to local authorities, academy trusts and governing bodies asking what they will do to protect and support teachers and leaders. NAHT accuses Ofsted of failing to heed an independent wellbeing impact assessment commissioned by the Inspectorate, which found the new report cards will increase stress and workload for school staff. Schools Week says the NAHT has written a template letter for school leaders to use, and a spokesperson said the action was not simply about workload, but about preventing avoidable harm. According to the article published on the 30th of September, at least 2 local authorities have already received letters from leaders. Steve Rollett, Deputy CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts, said it was seeking expert HR and employment advice in response to NAHT's guidance to members. This latest guidance from NAHT further highlights union concerns, and Schools Week also reports the union is considering balloting members for strike action. In TES magazine, comments by Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson are featured as she speaks about the issue of parental engagement. The article reports that Ms Phillipson has said school leaders should have more training and support on how to communicate with parents effectively. She said that engagement with parents is critical, but stated she had heard from school leaders that training they receive does not always help them learn the best ways to do this. Ms Phillipson's comments made at the Labour Party's annual conference included saying head teachers should not drift into judgment when interacting with parents or make parents feel talked down to. Further details on these comments, as well as Ms Phillipson's views on inspection and behaviour, can be found on TES magazine online. The BBC reports on school building collapse in Indonesia. 3 people have been killed and 99 others hospitalised, some with critical injuries. Rescue workers also face challenges as some pupils of the Kozing Islamic boarding school in East Java were trapped under rubble after the building gave way. The two-storey building, according to the Disaster Mitigation Agency, had an unstable foundation and could not support the weight of the construction of 2 additional floors. The collapse affected mainly boys who were gathered for prayers. Girls were praying in another part of the building and managed to escape. The school is a traditional Islamic boarding school in Indonesia, but does not fall under the Ministry of Education. Instead, it is monitored by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Further details can be found on the BBC World News Asia website. FE Week reports comments by PM Keir Starmer saying he has scrapped Labour's target of getting 50% of young adults into higher education and has set a new goal that includes FE and apprenticeships. The government will also pump £800 million extra into 16 to 19 education next year from the existing spending review settlement, including the creation of 14 new technical excellence colleges. The PM spoke at his party's conference and told the audience he will make it a defining mission to no longer ignore further education. He said the target of getting half of young adults into higher education, set by Tony Blair in 1999, is not right for our time. Instead, he said the country should be aiming for 2/3 of young people to get higher level skills, either through university, further education, or gold standard apprenticeships by the age of 25. Starmer singled out the value of further education, stating it has long been seen as the Cinderella sector, but this would no longer be the case in the government's forthcoming white paper. More details in FE Week. Finally, a teacher tap poll reported on by Schools Week suggests that 2/3 of schools do not have a sustainability lead as required by new climate change rules. The Conservative government's climate change strategy, first published in 2022, set out requirements for every school to nominate a sustainability lead from October 2025. But since Labour won power, little has been said about the plan. According to the Teacher Tap poll, only 24% of respondents said they were aware that their school had a sustainability leader, although this is up from 18% 2 years ago. Henry Greenwood from Green Schools Project said he was surprised but not surprised by the poll's findings, saying he often asks teachers and leaders if they know the Department for Education has a climate strategy and sometimes gets no hands up at all. A Department for Education blog published in January said the Labour government's climate strategy was preparing schools for the climate issues we face. Full details on Schools Week. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. I, for one, actually welcome the idea that we will get training in how to communicate with parents. And I hope that it's something that isn't just for heads, although I understand why they might be the kind of first wave, but is something that will be rolled out to all of us, because the number of times around report time, I've spoken to colleagues who have said, oh, how do I phrase this in a way that is going to be, nice for the parents to hear, but gets across what I want to say? Or I don't know what I want to say. I don't know how to say this. What can I write? And we do get very little training, particularly during our ITT, on how to do reports, how to do phone calls home. We're told that sending postcards about great work is a lovely way to reward behavior. But what do you write on the postcard? Nobody ever tells you that. So I do think that the training is a very good idea. And I hope, like I said, it's something that will be rolled out to all of us. But I wonder whether parents are also going to get training in how not to talk down to teachers. Spoilers, this is actually kind of what my show next week is about. Next week, we're going to be talking about the former prestige of teaching and where it's gone. And a lot of it is to do with, parental perception, public perception of what teaching is. But I think the issue of respect is a really interesting one. And the issue of how we talk to each other is a really interesting one, because respect is a two-way street. As teachers, we don't automatically deserve respect just because we are teachers. that may be a controversial thing to say. I'm not entirely sure. But I'm not sure that any profession is deserving of respect just by nature of it being a profession. I do think that we are worthy of respect by nature of us being people. And I think that there is an inherent lack of respect sometimes just in basic humanity that is often at the root of a lot of the communication issues that we have. But, I'm recognizing my bias as a language person. Communication is very important. We do build mutual respect through how we talk to each other. It just is about who is going to be the bigger party in taking that first step. And I guess, as always, it has to be us, the teachers. But we will revisit this next week. I don't want to kind of tread too much on future Darren's toes because he won't be very happy about that. Today, we are talking about censorship. We're talking specifically about self-censorship. I'm going to just lay my cards on the table to begin with and say I think that we all self-censor to some degree. I'm also going to say something that I am reluctant to say, but I'm not going to self-censor today. And that is that I think we should self-censor to a certain degree. I don't think that we need to lay out all of our ideologies, all of our beliefs, for all of our classes, because I don't always think it's necessary. So, controversially, I'm not opposed to self-censorship. Because I do it. I talk about this on the show quite often. There have been topics that I've thought would make for very interesting shows, but I've chosen not to engage with because I don't want to engage with any potential conversations afterwards, any awkward conversations afterwards. Ironic, I know, given that just 10 minutes ago I told you to get in touch with me on social media to discuss what we're talking about, but that's because the things that I choose to talk about on the show are conversations that I'm happy to have afterwards. There are some conversations that I'm not so happy to have afterwards. So I self-censor. And I don't think that the teaching community loses anything by not having my opinion on certain topics, because believe it or not, I don't think that highly of myself. So as somebody who does self-censor almost as an act of self-care, of self-kindness, I think self-censoring can be very liberating. I think it can be very important. I also think that there's an aspect of self-censoring that preserves what our job is about. I think a lot of the times that we start to get into very awkward territory as teachers is when we start playing jack of all trades because we have to. Again, I talk about this a lot here on Saturday Morning Breakfast. I talk about how one of the reasons that the academics of teaching falls further and further down the list of priorities is because we don't have other services for children. And I think if we did have other services for children, if we did have places that children could go to talk about their gender identities, talk about their sexuality, to talk about what's going on at home, to actually get support from people who are trained to actually support them, then that would free up teachers to focus on what they are supposed to teach, to focus on the content of their curricula, which then would take away a lot of the conversations we have about what is and is not appropriate for teachers to talk about in the classroom. Because whether we like it or not, when we are in the classroom, we are in a position of power. We are in a position of respect. We are in a position of responsibility. And we need to think very carefully about how we use that. We may think, when we've had 5 periods a day of having to tell children to stop talking about the number 67, and to make sure that all their feet are on the floor, so that we don't need to fill in the paperwork after they crack their heads open, that they don't listen to things that we say, but we know that they do. We know that they take on board the things that we say. We know that they most often remember the things that we say in jest or without thinking. And so we do have to kind of navigate a very complicated, very complex relationship between our own personal feelings and views of things, what we ought to be telling children, what our role is in terms of talking to children, and respecting who these children are, where they are coming from. And that can be very, very tricky. And this is where things start to get complex. And I do think that whilst censorship is always framed as a negative thing, and, I'm not denying that censorship is and can be used as a negative tool, as a tool of control, as a tool of power. I think sometimes we censor in order to keep ourselves safe. And as somebody who is very interested in teacher safety, in teacher safeguarding, I think that's really, really important. Kwame has texted in, good morning to you. I hope that I've pronounced your name correctly. Really happy to have you here. Love, love, love that we get people coming in from all over the world, spending their Saturday mornings for me. I'm not entirely sure where you are, so what time it might be for you, but spending your Saturday with us. So now that we've kind of unpicked my biases about censorship, so you know that we're coming from, let's talk about why this is important. I've pulled on an article because, what is a Saturday breakfast show without an article, from 2023 by Lammert and Godfrey, which is called Teachers' Self-Censorship of Children's Literature in Texas. What's legislation got to do with it? Love these articles that have really long titles. But at least that one is just very straightforward words that I can understand. So that's always a good thing. Now we know that Texas, as a microcosm of American education, isn't necessarily representative, let alone representative of world education. But what I do think is very interesting as a teacher in England is seeing what's happening in our political climate at the moment and seeing how Americanized certain factions are becoming, seeing how certain political parties are taking American issues and importing them, overlaying them onto a British context, regardless of whether they fit. And I think if we're seeing that in politics, it won't be long before we see it in education. So I think even though I wouldn't necessarily always look to a Texan context for thinking about schools in the UK, let alone an American context, I think in this case, it could be quite pertinent. And if nothing else, the article was really interesting. Their study investigated how pre-service teachers, so ITT students, were already starting to censor themselves even before they stepped foot in the classroom. And that was a response to these laws like the Texas Senate Bill 3 and the broader cultural climate of book bans in the US. So we're going to kind of look at why these pre-service teachers were self-censoring, what that self-censoring looked like, and whether or not it's a good idea. We're not going to answer that question because there isn't an answer to that question, which is why the title of today's show is Do We Censor? Not Should We? Because different people are going to have different ideas regarding whether or not we should censor, and if we do, how we do it and why we do it. So we're just going to look at the facts of it, what is happening, so that we can come to our own conclusions about how that impacts our own context, our own careers. First of all, though, let's step out again and think about why children's literature matters, why the books that we read to children are important. We are huge fans of children's literature here at Saturday Morning Breakfast. In fact, if you go way, way back in the archives to my very first show, that was all about children's literature. and I was joined by children's writer Tim Hughes, who talked about why children's literature is important and the types of literature that we should be having in our schools. That's, like I said, that's way back in the archives, but you can find that still if you are interested. And in fact, that show covers, or that topic covers, 2 shows, because as is always the way when you start something brand new, we had quite a few technical issues in that first one. So maybe listen to the second go around. But children's literature, young adult literature, middle grade literature, everything that spans the age range that we teach, it plays a vital role in the formation of children's identity. So it's like Rudine Sims Bishop argued, books act as windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. Love that quote. Love that concept. The windows allow young readers to see into experiences that are different from their own. The mirrors reflect back their own identities. They affirm that they belong, that there are other people like them. As I jokingly mentioned at the top of the show, humans will pack bond with anything, but we are designed to pack bond. We're designed to want to belong, to want to be a part of something, and letting children and young people see themselves reflected in the literature that we teach, in the books that we choose, in the textbooks that we are using, is a really important way of doing that. And then the sliding glass doors invite them into new worlds where they can imagine alternate possibilities. Not necessarily telling them this is something that you should be doing, but showing them that it's something that they could be doing. So when, as teachers, we choose texts for our classrooms, we shape what our children see. We shape, just as importantly, what they don't see. And we shape what they are invited to imagine. So literature gives us the power to affirm their identities, to challenge their prejudices, and to build empathy. But the flip side of that is that literature has the power to exclude. So when there are specific stories that are absent from our Year 3 classroom library, or from the film that we are choosing to teach for A-level MFL, or from the poetry that we are teaching in GCSE Greek, there are ways that we can subtly, even if unintentionally, say to children in our care, you don't belong. You're not welcome. And I'm not suggesting that anybody would do that purposely. And that's kind of the point, is that sometimes censorship isn't deliberate. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's just because we don't see beyond our own privilege. We don't see beyond our own way of thinking to think about what should be in the classroom, who does need representing. This is why then the stakes of censorship and self-censorship are so high. They go beyond pedagogy. They go beyond what we teach and the way that we teach, into the realm of democracy, into the realm of social justice, into the realm of who we are telling our young people we are as people. And again, there are people who will say, well, that's not really the teacher's job. It doesn't actually matter who the teacher is as a person, because the teacher is supposed to be a conduit of knowledge. Our job is to teach, to inform concepts, however you want to define subject teaching. And I would argue that that is absolutely true. But again, the way that children's services have been cut, the way that school is basically the only place a child goes to get anything, we are not just those transmitters of facts anymore like we were back in the Victorian times. Maybe we should be, maybe we shouldn't be. The reality is that we're not. So the reality is we have to think very carefully about what we are and are not implicitly teaching in our classrooms. And I think the wider communities have to accept that until they begin to invest, until communities invest in our young people. Teachers do have a responsibility to guide, to lead, to give, to demonstrate how a society functions, how a society should be lived. Now, the US is currently witnessing an unprecedented wave of book challenges. The American Library Association reported record-breaking numbers of challenges in 2021 and 2022. Now, of course, we do have to accept that we had heightened social issues in that time because of COVID, because of the Black Lives Matter movement that was very, very prevalent in the US. People were angry for all sorts of reasons. And challenging what's in schools is an easy way for people to express that anger. So I don't think it's coincidental that there were record-breaking numbers of challenges coinciding with COVID. But that doesn't take away from the fact that those challenges were there. We can give reasons for it, but whether we like it or not, they were there. Most of those challenges, surprise, surprise, were directed at books that feature LGBTQ plus characters, that feature racial justice themes, or that had discussions of history that challenged dominant narratives. Now, again, I did a few years ago a show about how we should or how we can approach difficult topics when teaching history. I based it around Guy Fawkes and the Catholic versus Protestant framing that story naturally has, and what we should be doing within school to kind of teach that to frame that in a way that isn't going to be upsetting to anybody. So there are all sorts of things that can be challenged. And I think quite often when we think about self-censorship, we do tend to dwell on LGBTQ plus themes, because that does seem to generally be the biggest bugbear amongst people, sadly. But it doesn't start and end there. And so, if you're a teacher who's sitting there thinking, well, I don't need to teach about LGBTQ plus themes in my lessons, therefore I'm okay, that's not necessarily the case. Anything that is to do with society, anything that is to do with social justice, anything that is to do with the world is open for debates about propriety. Now, Texas was the epicenter of this movement. So I mentioned earlier their Senate Bill 3. That was something that passed in 2021, and it restricts how teachers are allowed to talk about race, gender, and current events in the classroom. The language of Senate Bill 3 is quite vague from my interpretation, and I think that's quite often deliberate in the case of laws. They allow for a certain room for interpretation, which can be both positive and negative. I think most of us as teachers would just be more happy if we were told what we are and are not allowed to say. But of course, if you do that and you enshrine that in law, then you are very obviously creating a profile of censorship. Whereas if you keep your language vague and you make it look like the teacher has some autonomy over what they say, then blame can be shifted towards the teacher as opposed to towards the lawmakers, towards the bill itself. So the use of vague language is always deliberate, and it's always done to protect the people who created wherever those vagaries are. Teachers have, since Senate Bill 3 was passed, reported massive uncertainty about what is allowed. And so many will, I think, quite naturally and quite rightly, err on the side of avoidance in order to protect themselves. If you're not sure what is and is not allowed, if it's not clear what is and is not allowed, you will do the minimum to make sure you don't cross that line. And again, it's possible that that's very deliberate, because again, that puts the responsibility on the teacher, and it still gets across the idea that certain things should be censored because a teacher is not willing to cross that line in case they get into trouble. They haven't been told that they're not allowed to, so it can be framed as the individual teacher's decision. But what it is an act of self-preservation. It's weaponizing the fact that we know that teachers quite often get the brunt of hate from society, and we want to protect ourselves from that a little bit. But book bans, restrictive laws, they don't just silence authors, they don't just silence publishers, they also shape our behavior. So even before formal guidelines are issued, many educators are preemptively censoring themselves. They will remove books from their reading lists. They will avoid talking about controversial topics. They will choose the safer texts because that doesn't open us up to awkward discussions, although I think most of us will navigate awkward discussions really, really well. I don't think we mind the awkward discussions with our class. What we don't want is the negative feedback from parents, because that puts our livelihood in jeopardy. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. People outside of teaching have a lot of control over teaching. They have a lot of control over our lives as people, whether we can do our jobs, whether we can do the thing that we are trained to do or not, whether we have to start again at 45 because we've said the wrong thing in the classroom to the wrong student, the wrong parent. Which is, of course, not to say that teachers should be free from blame. If we have done something wrong, then we've done something wrong and there should be consequences for that. But there's a difference between doing something that's wrong and doing something that somebody else doesn't like. Which, of course, is yet another flip side to censorship, isn't it? Because we all have different morals. We all have different values. And I think we're always going to say censorship is wrong so long as the stuff that I believe in is the stuff that's under attack. I think we're going to say that sharing our viewpoints is okay so long as they're the viewpoints that I agree with. And I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of my own attitudes towards things, sort of preparing this show. Because I am a very pro LGBTQ plus person. I understand that children do struggle and they explore gender expression, sexuality, all of that sort of thing. I understand that there are LGBTQ plus students whom we teach. I understand that some of my children will have LGBTQ plus parents. Some of my children will have two mums, some of my children will have two dads. That's the reality of the world that we live in. And so I'm happy to kind of discuss those themes. You know, in A-level French, we talk about French paxé, civil partnerships, essentially, and kind of what that looks like against a traditional Catholic marriage. And we look at how that impacts LGBTQ plus couples. We look at mariage pour tous, equal marriage. And, you know, I teach about these things. Am I comfortable with the idea that a teacher might say that LGBTQ plus people should not have children, should not get married? And the answer to that is no. But do I have the right to say that that teacher should censor themselves just because their opinion is different to mine? And this is where we start to get very, very murky, with the idea of, you know, which opinions, which thoughts, which viewpoints are valid, because ultimately that's what censorship is about, isn't it? It's about what we are saying is okay, about what we are saying has validity. And I think before I talk myself round in circles and get myself in trouble, we are going to jump to an ad break.
At AQA, we work with the UK's largest teacher network to shape the future of assessment. With Teachers for Students, we ask questions today that matter tomorrow.
The 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles.
Let's just put current discussions into a historical context, because I think that's really, really important. When we look at book banning, again, specifically in a US context, we're going back to the 1950s, the McCarthy era, the Cold War anxieties. And in the 1950s in the US, the concept of the Red Scare shaped education just as much as it shaped politics. Any book that was suspected of having communist sympathies or leftist critiques were pulled from libraries. So this is not a new thing. The idea of book banning, the idea of censoring what is in a school library is not new. Teachers were pressured to avoid any material that could be seen as, in inverted commas, un-American. And of course, that relied on somebody defining what it was to be American. And in some districts, classics like The Grapes of Wrath face scrutiny because of their depictions of poverty and labor struggles. When we move into the 60s and the 70s, the US has got its civil rights era, and it's got its multicultural literature era. So the US civil rights movement began to demand more recognition of Black, Indigenous, immigrant stories, and schools began to introduce more diverse texts. The expansion, though, was met with a lot of resistance. Books that were addressing racial inequality or that celebrated non-white protagonists were usually targeted for being divisive or inappropriate. And I'm always intrigued by that term divisive, the idea that introducing stories with protagonists who are different to the children who are listening to them could be divisive, as if it's deliberately designed to provoke, because that's what divisive means, to divide, and division is deliberate. There's this iconic case of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which was Mildred Taylor in 1976. Great book. I studied that for... I think I did it when I was at uni. It was celebrated for depicting African-American family life in the Jim Crow South, but it was also frequently challenged for its use of racial slurs and its candid portrayal of racism. So in this context, we've got an interesting challenge, because can we use racial slurs? Can we depict the negativity of racism, even when it's being shown as wrong? And if we can depict it when it's being shown as wrong, can we depict it when it's being shown as right? And that's something that authors, that publishers, that book buyers, librarians, teachers have to think about. What message are we sending about ourselves, about how society works, about how society does work through the stories that we are choosing to use? What Mildred Taylor does in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry is create this mirror that reflects the real experience of a lot of those black children. She creates the windows that the white children can look through to see that experience. But by opening up that experience, it was seen as threatening. Then when we get to the 80s and the 90s, challenges increasingly centered on sexuality, profanity, and family values. So we've got the moral panics happening. We've got the AIDS crisis happening, and LGBTQ plus people, particularly gay men, being centered as the cause of the AIDS epidemic. Judy Blume's novels at this point became incredibly controversial. Judy Blume is known for her candid portrayal of puberty and adolescent concerns, and she was perpetually targeted during this time. Books like Heather Has Two Mommies, which is from 1989, became flashpoints in debate over LGBTQ plus representation in children's lives. 1989 is 35 years ago. We had a book published 35 years ago about a child protagonist who had two mothers, and it was challenged. Do I think it's right it was challenged? No, not if it was showing a mirror to a child who had two mothers. And if it was offering a window to children who had a mother and a father into what it was like, the experience of having two mothers. Am I surprised that it was challenged in the late 80s? No, because again, given the moral panic, given the sexuality anxiety that was happening at the time, I think that that the author was very brave to publish a book like that. I think that the publishers were very brave to publish a book like that because it was going to get backlash. Am I saddened that 35 years later, I keep saying 35, I really hope I've got that maths right, we are still having this conversation about whether depictions of same-sex parents is appropriate in inverted commas? Yes, I think that's very sad because we haven't moved forward in all that time. We moved forward very quickly from, Grapes of Wrath being censored. We moved on very quickly from Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, although I'm not saying that there are no longer issues about portrayals of race in books. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just find it very interesting that we are not moving on this quickly from our concern, in inverted commas, about portrayals of sexuality in books. And this is where we encounter this concept of a risky text, because at the heart of the censorship debate lies the concept of risk. What is a risky text? And for whom is a text risky? Now, traditionally, those who advocate for bans frame risk in terms of harm to children's innocence, harm to social cohesion, harm to moral standards. So there's this idea that books can pose a risk to society. A book then is seen as risky if it introduces ideas that might corrupt, confuse, or destabilize. But a lot of educators, a lot of scholars will flip this framing, and they will see that risk can mean intellectual growth, because a risky text is one that pushes students to think critically, to grapple with uncomfortable truths, to imagine possibilities outside of their own lives. So in this sense, a risky text is one that we don't necessarily have to avoid, but one that we should be embracing. And this is the tradition in which Lammert and Godfrey study sits. They argue that risk in children's literature is necessary and productive because it's about how young people encounter diversity, how they encounter injustice, how they encounter resilience in a way that is actually safe. Without risk, literature becomes bland, it becomes sanitized, it becomes disconnected from real life. But we have that question of who decides. Who decides which risk is worth taking? Who decides what views are lowest risk and so are okay for the books, and what views are highest risk and so are not okay for the books? Because again, we all have different ideas on what is and is not appropriate. We all have different viewpoints on what is and is not okay. And quite often, and maybe I'm being a bit too kind, but quite often self-censorship comes because we want to protect our own ideologies. We want to make sure that the things that we value are safely espoused, and we're a bit more hesitant about ideologies that we don't value. For example, I think that anti-immigration ideology is harmful. And if I picked a book to read to a year 5 class off of my bookshelf that had anti-immigration sentiments, I probably wouldn't read it, quite honestly. But that is also a form of censorship. I can justify it because I think that there are benefits to immigration. I don't think that my reading a book should make an immigrant child in my class feel uncomfortable. But I am still censoring anti-immigration views. And this is kind of the paradox of censorship, I suppose, is that censorship is always about saying, this idea is right, this idea is less right, wrong, whatever it might be. So I'm going to try and not discuss this wrong idea and celebrate this right one. If I were a brave teacher, I would perhaps read the anti-immigration book and use that as a talking point, use it as a discussion tool. And I would probably self-censor in that discussion because I would want to make sure that my children who had anti-immigration views felt just as part of the class, just as accepted by me as children whose views aligned with mine. And again, it all gets very sticky. It all gets very murky when we start to really pick apart how divisive some of these issues can be. It just starts to get easier to censor yourself, doesn't it? Because having the open discussion, having the logical discussion, looking through the pros and cons of both sides of the story assumes that you're going to have a respectful conversation, which again, you probably would with the child. But are we going to get that same respectful conversation from the parents? Is an incredibly anti-LGBTQ plus parent going to respectfully talk about Heather has two mommies and my decision to read it in class? Or are they going to come for my job? And if they're going to come for my job, is it safer for me to just not read it? And the answer to that is yes. Tim has texted in, good morning to you. Tim is a writer for children. So your views are very, very welcome on this topic. Tim says, I know there are various motivating factors around censorship, but like so many things, there's little nuance behind it. I know when I write, I have to consider the age group I'm writing for and tailor my language and stories for them. I write my characters differently for young adults than I do for middle grade readers, for example, not out of censorship, but considering their different worldviews at those life points. And I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes what we can consider censorship can just be propriety. And I think the reason that we tend to ignore that is often censorship is disguised as propriety. I think this a lot when we think about LGBTQ plus picture books. So there are lots of people who will say, you shouldn't have a picture book for 4-year-olds that has LGBTQ plus themes because they don't need to know about sexuality. They're too young to know about sexuality. But I never see that argument given for picture books that have a mummy and a daddy. When in fact, being parents is an expression of sexuality. If those parents are married, if they are the biological parents of the child protagonist, that is an expression of sexuality. And so quite often we can use the concept of what is age appropriate as a way of caching censorship in a way that doesn't look like censorship. But at the same time, I think you're right. Because if we are like, as Judy Blume did, if you are using literature to explore themes of puberty, for example, and giving children this safe space in which to engage with what is happening to them, engage with how confused they might be feeling, then the book that you're going to write with puberty themes aimed at an 11-year-old is going to be very different to the book that you're going to write with puberty themes aimed at a 17-year-old. And it's that nuance, isn't it, that you mentioned right at the beginning of your comment that is so important and that is so often lost because we just don't have or take the time to have these nuanced conversations. Tim has texted again. It's also crazy to me that people will protest drag queen story times, then take their kids to a pantomime starring lead characters in drag performing stories for children. I mean, that's a whole separate, very interesting conversation about perceptions of LGBTQ plus themes, not actually that drag is necessarily an LGBTQ plus what am I trying to say, art form, because straight people can perform drag, but it's that the concept of being LGBTQ plus is sexualized by society because it's a sexuality, kind of in a way that being heterosexual isn't sexualized necessarily. And then you have got the argument that anything about sexuality is inappropriate for children. So if you're going to assume that drag is sexualized because you equate it with LGBTQ plus themes, then you're going to say that it's not appropriate for children in a way that you're not going to do the same for a pantomime dame because you are not seeing that through a lens of sexuality. It is all very much about the way, the lens through which we view things, the way that we are seeing things. Which again is why that nuance is so important, because we all see things in very, very different ways. And this is where we get the kind of democratic paradox of schooling, I suppose. So thank you, Tim, because you're we couldn't have done this better if we had planned it, because your comments lead quite nicely into my next section, which is all about the fact that schools are supposed to be democratic institutions, spaces where all children, regardless of their background, can learn and can grow and can see themselves reflected. But they have also long been sites of control, where specific stories are silenced in order to maintain the dominant cultural norms. So you've got, on the one hand, movements for multiculturalism, movements for inclusive education that have expanded the canon. Teachers, librarians, we have all fought to make sure that we are including stories of historically marginalized communities. There was a We Need Diverse Books hashtag that trended not too long ago, which reflected that push to make classrooms mirrors and windows for all children. On the other hand, you have restrictive policies, you have book bans reminding us that schools are also spaces of exclusion, where there is very specific legislation that dictates what can and cannot be discussed. And when teachers self-center out of self-preservation, out of self-care, which means that the democratic promise of education is compromised. And this is not a new paradox at all. In the 1920s in the USA, debates over teaching evolution in schools highlighted that tension between democratic inquiry and cultural control. In the 1950s, loyalty oaths for teachers exemplified how political conformity was demanded at the expense of critical dialogue. And today's book bans are part of that exact same lineage. And I think a lot of it comes down to, as Tim has said, lacking that nuance, lacking those abilities to have the nuanced conversation, looking at the pros and cons of things, and trusting our young people to come to their own conclusions. I do think there is also a demonization of changing your mind. And we see this a lot at the moment on both sides of the political spectrum, but we actually see this a lot in cancel culture, in the idea that if you've done something bad once, then you are an awful, awful person, and you can never, ever be redeemed from that. You can never come back from that. And we very rarely get the opportunity to see people changing their viewpoints from a harmful one to a less harmful one. And those people that do, their experiences are often pushed down, they are squashed, they are seen as, oh, just trying to get back on the right side of the conversation, just trying to build your following back up. But that's sort of the point of education, isn't it? Is to see different viewpoints and to come to a conclusion. We get so obsessed with this idea that there is a right way to view the world that we start being scared of looking at alternatives. We start being scared of showing somebody a different way to see the world in case they adopt that. And again, that happens on all sides. This is really important for today, though, because if we situate contemporary self-censorship within this really long history of censorship, we can see three important patterns. Now, again, I'm not a historian. As I once said when I was asked if I was able to teach the French Revolution, because I was a French teacher, my understanding of French history stops when the country stops being called Gaul. So I'm not claiming that I understand from a historian's perspective how this all links together. But from what I can see as a layperson, if we situate the current discussion about censorship and, you know, the drag queen story times and the LGBTQ plus themes and migration and immigration, all of that, and we situate it in this 100-odd year history of censoring stories, we can spot patterns. And I think that's what looking at the past is about. It's about spotting patterns so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. I don't know who said it, but that whole those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And we can see, by situating this current discussion, a continuity of anxiety, because we can see that each era censors what it most fears. We can see communism being censored in the 50s. We can see racial justice being censored in the 60s and 70s. We can see sexuality and gender identity being censored in the 80s and the 90s. Although, ironically, if you go back and watch a lot of 80s and 90s TV, particularly comedy, interestingly enough, you will quite often see more diverse casting and more diverse themes than you will do today, which suggests that actually we are more scared of sexuality and gender identity today than we were back then. I was watching Birds of a Feather, BBC/ITV sitcom from the 80s through to the 2000s. It had a bit of a revival. I was watching that recently, rewatching it recently, and it occurred to me that of the three main characters, the three women, you had one of them who was very Jewish. She mentioned her Judaism multiple times per episode. She was presented as being a Jewish woman. She identified as a Jewish woman. And it made me think about the fact that there was quite a lot of Jewish representation on TV back in the 90s. There was, and I had her name just then, and it's now escaped me, but there was that very famous lady who did like the BT ads. And that kind of centered around the fact that she was Jewish. And yes, we had elements of caricature in there, but we also had some very authentic, very real representation. I don't remember the last time I saw a Jewish character represented on British television in a British produced show since then. If you look at a lot of the sitcoms from the early to mid 80s, particularly those that are set in London, you will see a lot of Black characters, you will see a lot of Indian characters, because we were still understanding that we had a lot of migration, a lot of immigration from places like Jamaica, from India, and those people were represented. And again, yes, there were caricatures. It wasn't the best representation, but we had that representation. Maureen Lipman. Thank you, Tim. Maureen Lipman. There we go. And then So Haunt Me, that's a new one on me, I think, with a matriarchal Jewish ghost. I love that. That's awesome. I have to look that up. But yeah, I have noticed that representation in general is worse now than it was back then. And you get a lot of discussion, particularly on social media, of how bad representation was back in the day because we had caricatures, because the humor was not politically correct. And I agree with those critiques. But I think it's worse now because we don't have that representation. Because TV is self-censoring, I think, honestly, is what's going on. In addition to this continuity of anxiety, we have the impact on teachers. We have always been in the front line. We've always been the ones who are being asked to mediate between cultural values, cultural ideals, and restrictive demands. And our pre-service teachers, our ITT students, they are the ones who are inheriting that legacy, but they are doing so under new conditions of legislative pressure and viral media scrutiny. We've all seen it. We've all seen a teacher teaching something and the video clip going viral on TikTok, on Instagram, on whatever it might be. And the reason that we've seen that is because the student thought it would be funny. The student thought it would be controversial, whatever, to whip out their phone and record it and post it. And particularly our Gen Z teachers, the new ones who are coming through, they grew up in that culture. They grew up understanding the impact that a viral video can have on your identity, on how people perceive you. And so they are going to be very careful of that because they did it to their teachers. And finally, we have these high stakes for democracy, because censorship is never just about books. It's about who is allowed to speak. It's about whose stories matter. And it's about what kind of citizens we are aiming to produce. Now, I will forever fight the idea that schools are playgrounds of indoctrination. You may recall, if you've listened to the show for an extended period of time, you may recall that we did have a relatively regular poster who liked to tackle me on this idea that schools exist to indoctrinate our young people. And I don't think that they do. But I can see how it could look that way because we close ourselves off to these difficult conversations. But again, do I necessarily think that schools are the places to have these difficult conversations? I'm not sure that they should be. I think that there should be other places that children can go where they can learn about things. I think I should be able to teach about verb conjugations. But that's not the reality that we currently live in.
At AQA, we work with the UK's largest teacher network to shape the future of assessment. With Teachers for Students, we ask questions today that matter tomorrow.
The 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles.
So let's finish off with the how. How do we prepare to teach a risky text? Because ultimately, particularly these days, any text could be deemed risky, regardless of what the actual text of the text is. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, again, in relation to social media. I've had social media on the brain this week, because as I mentioned at the top of the show, listening to discussions about why teachers, why academics need social media, kind of my move back to Blue Sky, all of that sort of thing, has made me very aware of how much we can know about each other all of a sudden that we wouldn't have known 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And at this point, I'm not talking about our social media as teachers. I'm talking about the social media of the authors whose books we choose to use. Because it doesn't matter whether you are plucking a fiction book off of the shelf. Let me just have a look. If you are reading Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes to your class, you can very easily Google Natalie, and you can find her social media profiles, you can find her podcast, you can find all sorts of things. If you are taking Harry Potter and reading that to your class, you can Google the author, you can find out all sorts of things about her own beliefs. So, whereas if I were reading an Enid Blyton book, if I were reading a Famous Five book to a class 20 years ago, it would have been almost impossible, unless you had studied Enid Blyton, unless you had read a biography, an autobiography, it would have been almost impossible to know about her political leanings. And any censorship that you had to do as a teacher came from the text itself. These days, you even have to be very careful about the authors whose texts you are selecting, because you can very easily find out what their beliefs are, what kind of people they are, and that's going to inform your choice of text. So we do have a lot to think about when we are preparing. And teacher preparation programs, they should give us really four things in terms of knowledge on choosing a text. They should give us knowledge of diverse children's literature, which will help us to build up a rich repertoire of texts. I would be interested to know how many of you listening who are teachers actually had any kind of input during your initial teacher training on the kinds of books, titles of books, authors that you should be using in your classes. Because I didn't. I trained primary, and even in our English lessons, we weren't particularly told, oh, these are some good texts to teach. We were just taught how to teach English. You know, we were taught about phonics, we were taught about SPAG, we were taught about why reading is important, but nobody ever gave us any suggestions, perhaps as a form of self-censorship, because they didn't want to be seen to be suggesting certain authors, suggesting certain books. That was something I had to go out and do myself. I ultimately, when after my first degree, I got my second undergrad degree in classics and English, I did an entire module on children's literature, which helped me to make better choices for my classes. But I don't think generally we are taught what texts exist. And so we kind of just stick within what we know, or what might be going viral, or what the librarian might suggest to us. Make use of your libraries. Your librarians are trained, they are knowledgeable. Go and speak to your librarian and ask about texts for your unit, your classroom, whatever it might be, because they will know. They have that knowledge. We need to be taught pedagogical strategies. We need to be equipped to facilitate discussions of sensitive issues. We need to be equipped to talk about the things that we do agree with and the things that we don't agree with. We need to have a very thorough understanding of policy and context so that we have the autonomy to navigate restrictions, to navigate legislation, to navigate community expectations without worrying that we are going to lose our jobs over what we're talking about. And we have to be allowed to foster our professional identity, because we need to have that courage, we need to have that agency to teach inclusively. Which means, practically, we need support from our higher ups. We need to know that if a parent complains about our choice of text, our head teacher is not automatically going to side with the parent, but will have a conversation with us about the text, about the lesson plan. We'll ask why we taught it, we'll ask, and we don't mind being asked to justify our choices. I actually quite like talking about pedagogy, believe it or not. Not that you would know that, from the fact that for 3 years I've come on here every Saturday morning and spoken to you about it. I would love to sit down with somebody and justify my uses of text, so long as we don't feel like we're being attacked for our use of text. But again, we're not always given these things, and those are what we need in order to do this properly. The study, Lammert and Godfrey's study, also revealed several gaps in preparation. So not just where we're not being prepared fully, but actually areas that we're not being prepared at all. The first is in silence around censorship. The fact that we don't have these conversations like I'm having with you today. And again, I understand why, because I very nearly chose not to do this show, because I know that talking about censorship itself can be controversial. I know that I could very easily put my foot in my mouth, say something that I didn't intend to say something that could be taken the wrong way, be challenged to defend my position, when really all I want to do this afternoon is have some lunch and read a book. But we have to have these conversations. Otherwise, nothing is resolved. I did a show I always say a few weeks ago. It was probably a couple of months ago now. It was during the summer, where I was looking at the history of complaints in education and this idea that nothing gets resolved actually, and it doesn't, because we don't talk about these things. We just let there be legislation, we let there be an inset day, and then we go back to our day-to-day lives. We go back to the nitty-gritty of teaching. Whereas in fact, if we are going to actually make any kind of change, if we as professionals are going to have any control over our profession and go, actually, no, we do know what we're doing, we need to have these open conversations. There is limited exposure to risky texts, which I think is interesting, because this is the self-fulfilling prophecy of censoring in schools. If we have, let's say, some B.Ed students, so students who have gone through, they've done their A-levels, maybe they did a gap year, then they've gone straight into training to be primary school teachers. So maybe they're 19, they're 20 when they go into university. They have just come out of school, potentially having never had risky texts read to them because their teachers were too scared to. So they don't necessarily know that risky texts exist. They're maybe not reading risky texts in their own time, because let's be honest, we all know that the big trend in publishing right now is throwaway, in inverted commas, spicy romance books, which are not particularly challenging. Not that I am judging if that's your favorite genre, you do you, reading is for entertainment. But if you are only reading within your genre, and your genre is not risky children's literature, then you're not going to know what's out there. So without familiarity of risky texts, you're going to stick to the safe canonical texts. You're going to stick to the ones that you know how to teach because you were taught them. There are gaps in knowledge about legislation, about what the law says, about what you can and cannot teach, about what you should and should not teach. And there is insecurity in pedagogy. So even when you have pre-service teachers who value diversity, they quite often lack the confidence to facilitate discussions on race, on gender, on sexuality. And this lack of pedagogical knowledge fuels self-censorship. And I think quite often this also comes from the uptick in the own voices movement. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, own voices is the very correct belief, in my opinion, very correct belief, that if we're reading books about gay men, they should be written by gay men. If we are reading books about bisexual women, they should be written by bisexual women. Not because straight authors can't write LGBTQ plus characters, but because those people, gay men, bisexual women, are traditionally marginalized within publishing, and having them write about their own experience is a good way to get the foot in the door so that they can then write their space opera or whatever it is that they may want to branch out and write about. But I think what that also does is it suggests that only LGBTQ people should be talking about LGBTQ plus topics. Only racial minority people, only people within racial minorities, I'm not actually sure of the correct way to phrase that, so I apologize, should be teaching about racial minority. Whereas for a lot of the heterosexual children in the class, for a lot of the white children in the class, seeing their straight teacher, seeing their white teacher talk about why LGBTQ plus people are important, talking about the contributions of Black people to science, to maths, to history, to whatever it might be, is important, because that's modeling why you need to care about people whose experiences are different from your own. And ultimately, that's why censorship is very dangerous, because censorship limits empathy and it hides the fact that humanity is shared, that humanity is what joins us all together, and that you can befriend somebody who is ideologically very different to you. You just have to understand where they're coming from. And that's what I'm going to leave you on today. Thank you very much. I hope that you have enjoyed today's show. I hope you felt it was worth listening to. I hope that you have taken something from it. I certainly have thought a lot about it. Good afternoon to you. Now, I'm not actually sure if your name can be pronounced. So you are I've got all my eyes. TYYTYTGGFF. I'm glad that you have been here, and I'm glad that that you've joined in. I hope that you have enjoyed today's show. Yeah, sorry, my mind went blank for a moment there. Do join us next week here on Saturday Morning Breakfast. I will be talking about teacher prestige and where it has gone. But before next Saturday, please keep Thursday evening open from 6 o'clock UK time, because I will be live with a host of stars within the MFL universe, talking about the best foreign language teacher CPD in a sponsored show. So that's coming up this Thursday evening. I do hope to see all of you there, because it promises to be a really good one. We're going to explore different online types of professional development. We're going to explore what professional development for language teachers ought to look like. We're going to explore the reasons why we should have professional development, all stuff that I am very, very interested in. And I am really excited to hear what my guests, Sylvia, Joe, and Maud, all have to say on the topic. So I will see you live. We will be on YouTube. We will be on LinkedIn. We will be, I presume, streaming on X. We are basically anywhere that you can get Teachers Talk Radio. We will be there and we will be live. So I look forward to seeing you then, just as much as I look forward to seeing you next Saturday for our next Saturday morning breakfast. Thank you very much. Have yourselves a great weekend, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.